Morning, everyone. My name is Zarah, and I work for a supermarket chain called Woolworths in Sydney, Australia, hence the name tag. I will be the first to admit it. Being an Android developer is pretty hard work. Chances are we spend most, if not all of our day in Android Studio, where there are hundreds of settings, configurations, and shortcuts that getting to know the tool can easily become overwhelming. Today, we are going to talk about finding joy in development through the small things, lots of small things. So we will go through setting up our workspace and some helpers that would hopefully make our day-to-day development work easier, prettier, and more joyful. We will then discuss useful configurations for Android Studio, plugins and tools that help with debugging, and tips on code organization and styling. But first up, a disclaimer. Even though we are going to talk about tools and tips and setups today, keep in mind that there is no one-size-fits-all solution that works for everyone. Experiment until you find the combination of tools and helpers that work for you and your workflow. So Android Studio allows us to organize our project into groups. I find that this helps me reduce the amount of clutter in the welcome page. And less clutter is always good, right? As an added bonus, we can show an icon for each project for even easier identification. Here, I chose the launcher icons for each of my projects. If, like me, you prefer to use the project view instead of Android view when opening new projects, we can set this up as the default in Android Studio when opening new projects. So just go to Help, and then click on Edit Custom Properties. At this point, if you don't have any, you might be prompted to create a new file, say yes, and then add the following line, and then restart Studio. So thanks to Kelly Schuster and Margaret MZ for this tip, which is really helpful for me because I find myself always switching to project view anyway. And similarly, for layout files, if you prefer using the XML editor instead of the graphical layout editor, you can set that as the default as well. So just search for Prefer XML in the Preferences pane and click on the checkbox. So reviewing pull requests, which is an essential part of our everyday job, is a bit hard. Sometimes it may even lead to arguments and frustration on both the reviewer and the reviewee. One way we can help make this part of our day go by smoother is by settling on a style guide with our team. Together with Lint, applying a style guide can help settle arguments before they even begin. A good starting off point that I think we should all follow is the Kotlin guidelines set out by Google. Square also has an installable style guide that we can use as well. One special thing I like in the Square style guide is the setting on organizing Android layout files. I tend to modify my layout files by hand in XML, and sometimes the ordering of the attributes get a bit messy and all over the place. I like how auto-formatting the file rearranges my code to make it more consistent and more readable. The Kotlin Style Guide also has a section on copyright headers. So if your company requires that you put one for each file that you create, you don't have to manually type this in each time. We can set up a copyright template in Android Studio. Note the templating syntax we use here. In this case, we automatically get the year and insert it into the copyright template. And then, so now that we've set this up, we don't need to insert it manually each time. But in case we do need to, you can just press Ctrl-N and then choose copyright. Once we have our template set up as before, updating all our files to have the current year becomes super trivial. Here we have an example of a file that was dated 2016. And if we want to update the copyright header to the current year, 2018, Android Studio has the ability to do that for us. We can also choose which files to update, such as everything in the project, everything in the current module, or just all the uncommitted files, or to include and exclude test files. Oops, my thing stopped working. All right. By default, logcat is very drab. Most of the texts are white, making it look like everything is just like running into each other, and it's difficult to figure out what is what aside from errors. Putting some color in gives us the ability to quickly see at a glance if there is something we should pay attention to, or more specifically, which line we should closely look at. Mati Scala suggested these colors to help us solve this exact problem. So what does it look like when we apply this? It's kind of washed out, but I guess you get the idea. I don't know if you can turn off the light. Probably not. But anyway, I'll share the slides later, and like you can see more closely how it looks like. But now our logcat is much more colorful and much more helpful. And if you prefer, you can tweak these settings some more, like add a background color or add a border around an error, just to highlight it more. So this is a tip that I've learned very recently from Igor Voida. I don't know if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but he mentioned this on Twitter and just took his image and dropped it in. So he mentioned something about if you want to distinguish generated files from actual written files by you in the Command-Shift-O list of file matches, you can define a color in a scope in Android Studio. So if you look at the top part there, just squint real closely, you'll see that he defined a scope for generated files, and then we match a color to that scope. And so now, every time we try to find a file, all the generated files will be colored. And I think this is really helpful for me personally because I tend to open generated files by accident all the time, and it annoys me so much. But now that they're visually different, I don't make that mistake anymore. Well, I still make it, but I make it less. Tools and helpers. Now we'll talk about some third-party tools and helpers that I tend to use a lot in my everyday development. So for an alternative version of logcat, we can install pidcat. It provides colorized log levels, it aligns everything nicely into columns, and most important of all, it reduces a bunch of noise that our normal logcat generates. Another tool I like to use a lot in Studio is the ADB plugin. It allows us to easily interact with ADB from within Studio without fiddling with the command line or with, like manual ADB commands. We can bring up all the available options via Control-Shift-A or search for actions via the universal search Command-Shift-A. I particularly like using Clear App Data and Restart, number 6, to simulate a fresh install of my app. It saves me a lot of time versus fiddling with the app settings or manually uninstalling and then reinstalling my app. If you use OKHTTP, I highly suggest that you use the logging interceptor that they have available. It displays a wealth of information about network requests, including headers, the request body, the response codes, even response times. Be wary, though, that if you set the log level to be as verbose as possible, it may leak sensitive information, so be sure to handle that properly. I like adding another interceptor for debug builds, Jeff Gilfeld's curl interceptor. It gives us a copy-paste ready curl command we can just copy and paste into the terminal. The original gist that I linked to here is written for OKHTTP 2, but it can easily be adapted to use OKHTTP 3. And now let's jump to some helpers that are actually built into Studio itself. The sample data within the tools namespace allows us to inject placeholder data or images into our layouts. It helps us visualize how our layout would behave with different types and lengths of texts, or even with different images. Refer to this developer.android.com link to see the full list of all available data types. So here it is in action for a simple name card or address book entry layout that kind of just mocked up together. So sample data helps us elevate our recycler view game. So taking our visualization from this very familiar, kind of useless one to this. So we can see that it is much more helpful already and helps us have a better view of how our layout will look like when we finally build our layout and deploy it to our device. If the text we need is not provided by the tools, so if you need anything other than like names, full names, last names, birthdays, all those kinds of things, we can also provide our own sample data. We can do this by right-clicking on your app folder and then selecting new and then create a sample data directory. We can then put in some plain text files in there with each item in our sample separated by a new line. As an example, I have created a file called cheese, which I borrowed from CheeseSquare, which is an open source app developed by Chris Baines like ages ago to demonstrate the design library when it was first released. And now we can use our cheese sample data in our layout files by referencing it as @sample/ and then the file name, which in this case is cheese. We can also put in some JSON files in case we want to mock up some data from our own pojos or models. Let's say, for example, we have an array of colors, and we contained it in a colors.json file. Let's say one of the entries in that file is this. So a color entry might have information such as the name, the category, different representations of its value, etc. If we then want to reference a color's hex value, for example, to use as a background, we can then reference that element in our array using this syntax. So @sample/colors.json, which is our file name, /colors, which is the array name, and then whatever entry or attribute you want to use. Android Studio helps us figure out what elements are available using its autocomplete. Let's talk a bit about live templates. Live templates help us insert frequently used constructs in our code. These constructs are things like for loops, or loops in general, conditions, logging statements, etc. There are some Android-specific ones bundled with Android Studio. So like me personally, I have lost count of how many times I have constructed a toast only to get into a panic when I don't see it show up when I'm testing my app. Live templates help us never miss calling a show on a toast ever again. So you see that it auto-completes everything and you just have to fill out the actual text and how long you want to show the toast for. There are also some Kotlin-specific templates, such as adding if not null checks, as I show here. And there are also some for XML files. So Android Studio has got us covered for everything. So this one I like specifically because instead of typing the whole layout with attribute, I can just type in LWM and it will autocomplete to layout with match parent. So same goes for the layout height attribute. You can also type in just LM or LH if you want to use constraint layout so that you just type in 0. You can check out all the available live templates by going to the editor, code style, and then live templates. There's a lot of them in there. So what about intention actions? Intention actions are Studio's way of telling us that as it scanned our code, it might have found some ways to optimize it, or it has detected some potential or maybe even actual problems. These are denoted by colored light bulbs, and we can action these suggestions by clicking on the light bulb or by pressing Alt-Enter. That's kind of like one way I learned how to program Android, just by pressing Alt-Enter everywhere. It kind of worked. Intention actions also work in XML. Say we have an existing layout file and we want to convert it to data binding, right? We can do so by just pressing Alt-Enter on the layout file's root tag and then choosing Convert to Data Binding Layout, and Android would wrap everything in all the tags required by data binding for us. And in our Kotlin code, if we have a for loop that we want to convert to the indexed variant, we can do so using some intentions as well. So just like live templates, there's a whole lot of them in Android Studio, and we can take if you want to take a closer look, they're all under editor, code style, and intentions. So I know spiders are not bugs, but I like the photo and I'm presenting, so you all just have to deal with it. So a lot of devs I have worked with in the past, they tend to launch an app in debug mode when starting a debugging session. This is the bug with the green play button on it. And this is fine for smaller projects, right? But as your project grows, it may take some time before the app actually starts to launch. At some point in the past year, I think when I tried to do this on our project, it takes like a minute or so before the project actually launches. So it's not really a great way to start debugging. A faster way to get into debug mode is to launch our app as normal and then attach the debugger afterwards. So you can attach it to a running process. Android Studio has a lot of shortcuts, but if there is a shortcut, if there's an action, that we use all the time that does not have a shortcut, we can create one for it very easily. So such an action that we should use but does not have a shortcut is the one I just described, attaching the debugger to a running Android process. So to create the shortcut, we need to go to Preferences using Command comma, search for the action we are looking for, in this case, attach, right-click it to create a shortcut, and try different combinations of keys until we find one that we can use. So I eventually ended up with just jamming all the modifiers together and then A for attach. But it worked, so now we can use a couple of shortcuts to debug our application. The first is Control-R to run the app, and then our just predefined shortcut. In this case, it is like the pretty convoluted Control-Alt-Command-A. But hey, we've attached the debugger, so yay. So fragments are making a comeback recently with the introduction of the navigation architecture component. So if we find ourselves dealing with them again and we want to see the inner workings of the fragment lifecycle, we can enable debug logging on the fragment manager. What this actually does is very interesting. So it allows us to see lifecycle state transitions, bundle values if there are any, instance IDs. In this case, this is the Topeka sample app from Google. I'm in the sign-in screen and I rotated it so you can actually see the fragment lifecycle moving from on-save instance state to restoring the instance state. There's a lot of information that enabling this setting does. All right, breakpoints. One tool that is extremely useful when we are debugging are breakpoints. It allows us to inspect what our code is doing at a particular point in time. Breakpoints become massively more relevant when we apply conditions to them. For instance, we can only tell it to suspend the thread only on iterations that we are interested in. In this example, we tell Studio that the breakpoint should only be stopped at if the user has selected the second item in a list. We can also open the breakpoints dialog via Command-Shift-F8, and we are shown more options. Let's say we want to display more information, right? So aside from stopping at the breakpoint, we can tell Studio to evaluate a particular expression and log it to the debugger console. So in this example, I'm telling Studio that, okay, suspend the thread when the user has selected the second entry in the list, but also log the name for accessibility value for that particular entry in the list. And aside from stopping at specific lines of code, we can also tell Studio to suspend on like random exceptions. So this is particularly useful if, say, we are encountering a null pointer exception or an array index out of bounds exception and we don't know where it's coming from. If we set a breakpoint, an exception breakpoint, so in this case, I made a sample of an array index out of bounds exception. Every time our app is about to crash due to this exception, IntelliJ will suspend the session at the exact line that is about to throw it. So then when we're stopped at that line, we can then inspect what's going on and figure out what's happening under the hood. Sometimes I find my breakpoints getting out of hand, especially when I'm debugging, like when I'm looking at a particularly nasty bug. And when I get into this situation, I get into like lots and lots of breakpoints, and I find that grouping them together helps me get myself organized and my thoughts organized as well. One advantage of grouping breakpoints is that we can enable or disable them all together all at once. So it means like if say I was like, okay, I thought I fixed this bug, but I may not have, so I really don't want to remove all my breakpoints, I just want to disable them. So if you group them together, you can do that whole action on a whole bunch of them all at the same time. All right, let's talk about the debug tool window. Because we're debugging, so we're looking at the debug tool window. The debug tool window, it shows a wealth of information whilst we are in a debugging session. If you don't have this view available in Studio, you can open it via View, Tools, Tool Windows, and then Debug. And it kind of looks like this. That's the default of how it looks like. A nifty thing we can set in the debugger is to display values in their more relevant form. So for instance, if we're looking at a text view and we want to check if the text color is actually what we want it to be, we can display those colors as hex values. This will make it much easier for us to figure out if the color is what we set it to be or if somewhere, somehow, our style is messing it up, or things like that. If the variable we are inspecting is used in an expression, we can evaluate that expression by highlighting the whole thing and then pressing Alt F8. We can then edit the expression in the resulting dialog if we need to. So in this case, I don't think I did any edits. And then when you're ready, you can click Evaluate, and then now we can see what the result would have been if this expression was actually ran. Most of the time, however, we are kind of not interested in doing things on the fly or computing things on the fly. We know what variable we are looking at. We know if there's any property of that variable we want to look at, or if we are doing any operations on that variable at all. So this is when watches become extremely useful. To add the expression that we just evaluated previously to watches, we can press Command-Shift-Enter, as I highlighted there, whilst the Evaluate dialog is open, or we can also add it manually via the Variables and Watches pane. So the main difference between watches and variables are not a lot. So you can think of it as all watches are variables, but not all variables are watches. Mainly because watches persist across debugging sessions, whilst variables are transient and are only available in the current context. Variables are also automatically collected based on what the debugger sees when it's stopped at a particular frame of your code, whereas watches can be basically anything you want it to be. As long as the debugger can resolve it, a watch would have a result for you. So at some point earlier in the year, I don't really know when, but variables and merges were merged into one pane. Before they were in two separate things, and then now they're in one thing. And I found it a bit confusing because I always like my watches to be in a separate thing because they're permanent and they persist across all my debugging sessions. So like, why are you mixing it up? And whilst I'm preparing for this talk, I found out that we can still have that setup. We just need to click on that little spectacle on a window icon and everything is back to normal. Yay, just like old times. So I like watches a lot, if you probably could tell, because I feel like I get a lot of benefit from it. One being there's no need to timber or toast or log or whatever, all the variables that we are interested in, or like logging. Well, what if we go like one index further? What will happen? Or what if we add 1 to this expression? What would happen? So instead of like logging all those possibilities, you can just like add watches to them and everything would be computed for you. And so yeah, as I mentioned, it's a quick and easy way of viewing results by changing expressions on the fly and answers like what would happen if. And if you want to know more about watches and what you can do with them, you can read more on the IntelliJ blog that I linked to here. So now let's talk a bit about debugging our manifest. If we want to take a closer look at our app's manifest, if say there's some fishy permission that you know for sure you're not requesting, but somehow your app is requesting your users, it would be pretty helpful in that case to look at our app's manifest. So if you click on the second tab, if you have the manifest open, it's called the merged manifest view. It shows all the available elements in the manifest when the APK is generated, and more importantly, where those are coming from. In this example from Topeka, manifest elements come from its multiple modules. So Topeka is a sample app that demonstrates having an instant app version and an installed app version, and that's why it's like very modularized. So if you're going for that, like I highly suggest you look at this app. And if your app has third-party libraries and dependencies that contribute to the manifest, you would see them in this list too. What's really nice about it is that you can click through all the links and it will take you to the actual manifest of that library that's contributing to your manifest in turn. And I thought I'd briefly mention the APK analyzer as well. So last year, I have been working a lot, or maybe 2 years ago, I've been working a lot on an instant app for a company I used to work for. And the APK analyzer and I became really close friends. So this is like a very simple tool, but it's really powerful because if you are in that position where you are optimizing your app, may it be for like APK size or method count or for any other reason that you may want to optimize your app, the APK analyzer is a very helpful tool. You can click and drag an APK onto Android Studio and it will automatically open the tool. Or if you are looking at the debug build that's built in Studio, you can just double-click an APK from there as well. The tool also has the ability to compare two APKs side by side, so you can closely monitor improvements or maybe regressions on your optimization attempts. All right, let's go through some miscellaneous stuff. All right, one of my most used shortcuts is probably Command F12. Bringing it up shows the file structure dialog, and it is really useful when we need to find a method in a massive class with like lots and lots of methods. So I know you can always do Command F and do a search, but really Command F12 is where it's at, yo. It is doubly helpful when we combine it with IntelliJ's fuzzy finder, and we will touch more on this a bit later. What really sold me on Command F12, though, is that it works in the manifest too, where it can be quite hard to find stuff because everything's just an activity. And for me personally, the manifest is probably one of my most neglected files. Like, I rarely go into it and actually organize stuff, so Command F12 is really helpful there. Another one of my favorite shortcuts is Command Shift O to open any file. It is super useful because we don't have to hunt down the specific file that we want. It becomes less useful when there are too many matches. So as I mentioned, Topeka is an instant app, demo app, right? So there's a lot of modules, and in each module there's a build.gradle file. So when you try to search for build.gradle, you end up with a lot of matches. And then you have to figure out, okay, so which one do I actually want? So it's less useful. But we can make it useful again in cases like this. We can use the /delimiter to tell IntelliJ that what we are looking for is something that's in a nested directory. So in this example, we tell Studio that we are looking for a file that starts with B, that's in a folder that starts with C. It's like a puzzle. And it matches us with the categories build.gradle file, which may be what we want. Speaking of fuzzy searches, we can use this pattern to find things in almost any window in Studio. So here I show it for the project view on my right, and the photo on my left. I show it when I use it for the Gradle window. So I'm searching for the install debug command. And still speaking of searches, remember that there are two ways of searching in Logcat. The first one is via the search bar at the top there, at the upper left. And typing anything in there filters out the results in Logcat. So this is important to remember. It filters things out that don't match what you type in there. And the second way of searching is by pressing Command F from within Logcat, and this would only highlight the matches of your current term. So if you want to search for something but still see the context in what that line appeared in, maybe you'd want Command F instead of the actual filtered search. All right, so column multi-select. I was aware of this feature in Studio, but I've always been like, I don't know when I'm gonna use it. But then I discovered that it is actually pretty useful. So it's actually super useful when you're trying to convert stuff from one layout to another. So in this case, I'm converting a weirdly formatted file, I think it was from Python, to a JSON file. Or when you're trying to add serialized names for converting something for use by retrofit, for example, or by JSON, or whatever your parser may be. So to get into this columnar multi-select mode, you can press Alt while clicking and dragging the rows that you want to edit. And then you can just type in, as I do here. See how it's pretty cool. In some instances, we might have to manually copy the full reference of a class. Like, say, if you're using data binding and for some reason autocomplete does not work, and we know that data binding needs the full reference for use as a variable, right? So to do this easily, we can put the cursor where the class name is, and then press Command-Alt-Shift-C. And it copies the whole reference of that class. So you don't have to manually type it in. And if, for instance, we want the full file path of a specific file instead, you can press Command-Shift-C, and we get the absolute path. So in this case, you see like the full path of like user, Zarah, whatever, of the whole file. So it's useful if you want to use it in Git or in Terminal or wherever you need the absolute path. And remember that if we forget any shortcut we want to use or are just curious, we can search for shortcuts via Command-Shift-A. This is like the shortcut of shortcuts. It's just Command-Shift-A, start typing, and then it will show you what the shortcut is for something you're searching for. And if you are interested in learning more about shortcuts, I highly recommend that you install Key Promoter, and it will just annoy you to no end until you actually use the shortcut. So when you try to do something with your keyboard or your mouse, it will actually tell you, there's a shortcut for that, and this is this. So it's very annoying. It will make you learn. And if you want to see how you are progressing in terms of using shortcuts and all the productivity tools within Studio, you can go to Help and then choose Productivity Guide, and it will tell you how many times you have used any and all of the shortcuts. So like, this is a pretty new laptop, so I haven't used much, but it does tell me that that IntelliJ has saved me 4 bugs per day. Cool, thank you. But yeah, it will tell you how many times you've used something. So probably autocomplete is the most that I've used for like all my life. And so that's it. If you have any bugs on Android Studio, please report it to the Android team. Make sure to copy the Android Studio build info from the welcome page. I'm sure they'll appreciate it. And that's all for me today. Thank you.